The warp does not scream all at once. That is the first thing they do not tell you. They teach you the prayers. They fit you with the diadem and the bandeau of dark silk that covers your third eye when you walk among the ungifted. They teach you the mathematics of transit, the coordinates of the Astronomican's light, the approved channels through which to report anomalous psi phenomena. They train you for years in the great house academies, surrounded by your kin, all of you bearing that mutation they call a blessing, and everyone else calls an abomination. They prepare you for nearly everything. They do not prepare you for the fact that the warp does not scream all at once. It begins as music. My name is Osius Dorn Pelaskis, third-grade navigator of House Pelaskis, assigned to the Void Trader vessel Unbroken Covenant for 11 years of service before the crossing that is the subject of this testimony. I am recording this in the Covenant's tertiary Medicae Bay with the blessing of Captain Mira Sodale, who has given me 4 hours before she turns me over to the inquisitorial representative waiting in the docking ring at Port Seraphon. I expect I will not see the bay's steel walls again after those 4 hours conclude. The walls are gray. They smell of counterseptic and old promethium. I find I want to remember gray walls and honest smells. I want to remember something simple. What I discovered in the crossing of the Calyx Deep is not simple. I did not know, when we translated into the warp above Therax Prime, that what I would experience would be different from the 47 transits I had logged in 11 years of service. I knew the signs I was trained to watch for. I knew the Gellerfield's rhythm, the hum that travels up through the deck and into the soles of your boots and becomes, over days of transit, something you feel more than hear, a pulse, the ship's heartbeat against the warp's infinite hunger. Every navigator knows that rhythm. After enough transits, you stop noticing it. It becomes like your own pulse. It becomes simply the sound of being alive. I should have noticed when that rhythm changed. I did not. That is the first failure. I should explain what it means to navigate for those who have not sat in the oculus and opened what the Imperium politely calls your third eye. I should explain because without that understanding, nothing I describe will carry its proper weight. The oculus is a chamber at the apex of the navigator's tower, which sits amidships on most void-faring vessels above a certain displacement class. The Unbroken Covenant was a vagabond-class merchant cruiser, 140 years old, with a navigator's tower that had been retrofitted after the original, was destroyed in a skirmish near the Damocles Gulf before my tenure. The replacement was functional, but graceless, steel and reinforced armor glass where the original had been ceramite and ablative shielding. My predecessor, third grade Avelius Moore, complained about it in his logs until his last entry. He died of cardiac failure during a transit. The Medicae said it was natural. I always wondered. The oculus itself was perhaps 4 meters in diameter, domed with a single reclined acceleration couch in its center and the interface controls at arm's reach. The chair was old enough that it had conformed to the shape of every navigator who had sat in it, which meant it fit no one precisely. I had learned to compensate for this. A folded flight blanket under the small of my back, adjusted before each transit. 11 years had taught me exactly which angle reduced the ache in my lumbar. These are the things you learn when the chair is your world for days at a stretch. Above the chair, where the dome met the tower's apex, there was the shielding panel. When closed, it was simply a sealed dome, reinforced against the void. When open, it was a viewport into the warp itself. You did not open it with your physical eyes. You opened it with the third. I will not describe the third eye in the language the House Academies use, because their language is designed to minimize, to contain, to prevent the novices from panicking and tearing the diadem off before their conditioning is complete. I will describe it honestly. The third eye is not truly an eye. It is a node of psionic sensitivity, grown over generations of selective breeding within navigator houses, that allows the bearer to perceive the immaterium directly. When I remove my bandeau and open that perception in real space, I see colors that have no names in high Gothic or low. I see the emotional resonance of the people around me as faint luminance, their fear pale blue, their contentment amber, their anger a red that burns like a forge. I see probability as shimmer. I see death as a darkening. In the warp, the third eye sees everything. That is both its gift and its terror. In the warp, properly shielded within a functioning Geller field, a navigator perceives the immaterium as a vast, hostile, impossibly complex current of emotion and intention and hunger made manifest. It is not safe to look at directly for long periods. You sweep it as a sailor sweeps the horizon, seeking reference points, seeking the distant beacon of the Astronomicon. You do not stare. You glimpse, and you correct, and you glimpse again. Navigators who stare develop conditions that the houses record in sealed files and do not discuss in the company of the ungifted. I had 47 transits behind me. I knew how to look. What I am telling you is that I knew my instrument. I knew the warp the way a cartographer knows a coastline he has charted 100 times. Not perfectly. The warp is never perfectly known, but well enough to understand when something has changed, when the current has shifted, when the light of the Astronomicon is brighter or dimmer than it should be for our position. I was not a novice. I was not unprepared. That is important for you to understand. I was not unprepared, and it found me anyway. The transit from Therax Prime towards Seraphon was logged as a standard crossing. Estimated duration: 11 days in ship time. The Calyx Deep is not a simple route, but it is not a notorious one. I had crossed it twice before in my service, once under third-grade Moore's notes and once under my own hand. There are recorded currents that push transit time longer if you fight them. There is a region, the old charts mark as Psi Turbulent, near the estimated midpoint that requires additional vigilance. I knew these things. I prepared accordingly. I filed my pre-transit assessment with Captain Sodale 3 hours before we made translation, listing the precautions I intended to observe. She read it at her desk in the captain's surveyor room while I waited. She read it the way she read everything, thoroughly, without hurry, running her thumbnail along the lines as she went. Mira Sodale was 53 years old, gray at the temples, with the kind of face that has processed significant difficulty and come out weathered rather than broken. I had served you under her for 9 years. I trusted her judgment. She trusted mine. This mutual trust was, I think, more valuable than either of us understood at the time. "Any reason to delay?" she asked. "No, Captain." "Then we translate on schedule." She signed the assessment and returned it to me. "Emperor's Grace, Pelasgus." "Emperor's Grace, Captain." These were the standard parting words before a transit. I had exchanged them with her 11 times before that crossing. I did not think about them as I climbed to the tower. They were ritual, comfort made habitual. I removed my flight sandals at the tower's base because the deck vibration was easier to read in bare feet. I did the folded blanket adjustment. I ran through the Geller field confirmation with the engineering team through the Vox. Green, across all indicators. I seated the interface contacts at my temples, felt the familiar low buzz of the field diagnostic running through my nervous system, and I waited for the translation sequence. We translated cleanly. The Calyx Deep received us without drama. For the first 3 days, I have nothing unusual to report. I ran my standard observation schedule. 3 hours of active navigation per day cycle, with 2 shorter monitoring periods and continuous passive Geller field telemetry feeding to my interface during rest. The Astronomicon was clear. The currents were as expected. The Psi Turbulent zone appeared on my perception at the predicted position, and I adjusted our heading to clip its outer margin, which is the standard approach. The ship's company went about their routines below. I ate my meals in the tower, which is custom for navigators in transit. I slept in the couch, which is not required, but which I preferred because it put me closer to the passive telemetry feeds. The field held it nominal. The hum was as it should be. On the morning of the 4th day, I noted, Ed the music. I do not know how else to describe what I perceived first. It was not what I was trained to look for. The warp's hostile presence is manifest to navigator perception in several standard forms. Sudden visual intrusion when an entity is pressing against the field, pressure spikes that register as pain in the third eye's neural pathway, interference patterns in the Astronomicon's beacon that indicate a current of strong malign intent passing nearby. I knew all of these. I watched for all of these. This was none of them. It was a pattern. a repetition in the warp's background churning that I had not noticed because I had been looking for the registered forms of threat, like a sound beneath a sound. When you are in a manufactory floor and you stop hearing the machinery as noise and start hearing it as rhythm, something your brain assembles from separate inputs into coherent pattern. I had been inside the warp's machinery for 3 days, and on the morning of the 4th, the pattern resolved. It was almost melodic, in the way that coincidence is almost meaning, in the way that 1,000 screams heard from a distance might be almost song. I ran a full Gellerfield diagnostic. It returned green across all indicators. I ran it again. Green. The field was nominal. What I was perceiving was not field degradation. It was something else. I logged it. Anomalous psi pattern observed, 4th day of transit. Time approximately the 3rd hour past the morning bell. Pattern assessed as potentially natural warp turbulence. Repeating structure likely coincidental. Will monitor. That was my error. Not my only one, but the first. The music changed on the 5th day. Changed is perhaps imprecise. Clarified, the way a signal clarifies when you align your receiver correctly. I was in my standard morning observation session, sweeping the warp margins through the third eye. Checking our heading against the Astronomican's bearing, when I realized I had been hearing the pattern for 20 minutes without noting it. It had slid below my attention. The ship's hull had a rhythm. The field had a rhythm. My own heartbeat had a rhythm. The pattern had joined them, had become part of the background music of transit. I stopped. I made myself stop and listen specifically for it, which is a different discipline, requiring attention trained to isolate rather than integrate. I isolated it. It was not melodic by any definition a musician would accept, but it had structure. A rising sequence of pressure changes, repeating it irregular but not random in intervals, with variations that suggested, if I were not careful, if I were not rigorously disciplined in my interpretation, something like language, something like voices, dozens of them perhaps more. The way you might hear voices in a crowd heard through a wall, unable to parse words, but unable to quite deny the intention behind them. I filed a second observation. I requested a consultation with the ship's senior engineer regarding Gellerfield calibration. Engineer Varl Methes came to the tower base and spoke with me through the intercom, because navigators do not receive visitors to the tower during transit. He was precise, methodical, indispensable. He had served the Covenant for 22 years and regarded the Gellerfield with the affection a weaponsmith reserves for a particularly reliable blade. He told me the field calibration was nominal. He told me the harmonic resonance readings were within established parameters. He told me that occasional psi background variation in the calyx deep was documented and expected. Third-grade Pulaskis, he said. The field is holding. I know the field is holding, I said. I am reporting what I am perceiving through the third eye, which is a separate instrument from your telemetry. A pause. I don't question the third eye's sensitivity, sir. I'm telling you what the instruments show. Log that I've raised the concern. Already done. He disconnected. I returned to the couch. The pattern was waiting for me when I opened the third eye again, exactly as I had left it. Patient. That was what unsettled me in ways I was not yet ready to articulate. Its patience. The warp was not patient. Everything in the warp was motion and hunger and intent, churning and pressing and seeking and howling against the membrane that kept us alive. The warp did not wait, but the pattern was waiting, in the way that a voice waits to be heard. I did not sleep that night. I monitored. I told myself I was being thorough, professional. Navigators who become hypersensitive to minor psi variation develop avoidance behaviors that compromise their navigation. I had seen this in 3 colleagues over 11 years. I would not become a 4th, but I did not sleep. And when morning came, the pattern was louder. Let me explain what the Geller field is, for those who have not had the luxury of formal education on the subject. The warp is home. I mean this literally and without metaphor. The warp is the dimension through which the immaterium flows, the psychic substrate of reality, and it is host to entities for whom our dimension is equally foreign and equally hostile. These entities are real. Their hunger is real. The material universe is to them something like sunlight is to a man kept underground for years. Brilliant, burning, unbearable, and irresistible. Every human who has ever felt fear, joy, hatred, longing, despair has contributed to the warp's churning sea of emotion made solid. Every prayer offered to the God Emperor ripples through it. Every atrocity committed by his servants sends ripples through it. A ship in transit through the warp is a morsel in a sea of hunger. The Geller field is the shell, an energy projection that imposes a bubble of real space around the vessel, a pocket of material physics suspended in the immaterium. Without the field, translation into the warp is immediate death, followed by something considerably worse than death. The entities of the warp do not simply kill, they consume. They translate meat and metal and thought into raw material for their own incomprehensible purposes. The field holds. This is what you tell yourself. The field holds, and the hum continues, and you navigate by the light of the Astronomicon, and you emerge safely at the other end of the transit, and you log your observations, and you sleep in a real bed, and you eat real food, and you pretend, for a while, that you did not spend days suspended in a sea of things that want to eat you. The field had always held in my 47 transits. On the 6th day of the Calyx Deep Crossing, the pattern in the warp made its first direct attempt to communicate with me. I describe it that way with full awareness of what it implies. I describe it that way because any other description would be less accurate. What happened at the second monitoring period of the 6th day was not random psi turbulence. It was not warp static interfering with my perception. It was intent, directed, and specific, and it was directed at me. I had opened the third eye from my midday observation. The Astronomicon's bearing was slightly stronger than expected, suggesting a current running in our favor, which was welcome news I was in the process of noting for adjustment. Then the pattern flared. Not louder, but sharper, focused, like a lens bringing dispersed light to a point. And from the point, not music, not pattern, a single pressure, sustained, carrying something I recognized in the primitive pre-rational part of man. Within, Navigator's instinct as a question, not words, not language as I understand language. Something older than words, older than minds that organize experience into language. It asked, "Do you hear us?" I slammed the shielding panel down with my conscious mind, interrupting the connection, and sat upright in the couch with my pulse at 140 beats per minute and sweat running into my eyes. The dome was sealed. The third eye was closed. The Geller field's hum was still there. Still steady, still green. On every telemetry indicator. I sat for a long time, not thinking, breathing, counting the hum's rhythm. Then I opened my log and wrote, at midday observation period, apparent directed psi contact attempted. Single instance, event. No degradation of Geller field indicators. May represent anomalous warp entity, localized pressure event. Flagging for inquisitorial review upon arrival at Port Seraphon. I described it as clinical as I could. I used the approved language. I used the categories I had been taught. I did not write what I had felt, which was recognition, as though whatever pressed against my perception from outside the field was not alien, was not the cold hunger I had been trained to watch for, but something that knew what I was in a way that suggested it, had been waiting specifically for me. I considered whether I should inform Captain Sodale. I decided against it. The field indicators were green. There was nothing she could do. Flagging an unconfirmed psi contact event would cause anxiety in the ship's company with no corresponding benefit. I was the navigator. I would manage this. That was my second error. On the 7th day, the screaming began. But the screaming was not what I had expected screaming to be, and that is why I am still processing what I heard 11 days after our translation back to real space. I had always understood, in the abstract way one understands things learned from text rather than experience, that the entities of the warp sometimes pressed against Geller fields with sufficient force to become audible to those sensitive enough to receive them. It was documented. Older navigators spoke of it in the private gatherings of the houses, the closed-door conversations from which junior members were excluded until they had enough transits to understand what they were hearing. I had been given access to those conversations for 3 years. I had heard accounts. What they described was horror, raw and unmediated. Voices of entities whose mouths were made of hate, whose language was suffering, whose intent was the obliteration of consciousness. The older navigators who spoke of it did so with the careful flatness of people who had learned to process the memory without being re-destroyed by it. Some of them showed physical tells, a hand that shook, a pause before speaking, eyes that went briefly elsewhere. They were giving me information. They were also showing me without words what the information cost. This is what I was prepared for. What I encountered was different. I am not telling you that it was worse, though I am not certain it was not. I am telling you that it was different in a way that the preparation did not cover, and the gap between what I was prepared for and what I experienced was where the real damage was done. The screaming that began on the 7th day was not the voice of entities that wanted to destroy me. I am certain of this, and my certainty is itself the most troubling thing I have to report. It was not the howl of hunger. It was not the cold targeting of malign intent. The screaming that came through the warp's membrane, pressing against the field, with a force that was below the threshold of instrument detection, but entirely within the threshold of navigator. Perception was the screaming of people, human people. I cannot prove this. I want to state that clearly at the outset of this account. I cannot verify by any method available to navigator training or inquisitorial doctrine that what I heard were human voices. The warp is capable of mimicry. The entities that inhabit it are, according to every source I have access to, capable of presenting themselves in any form that will weaken a navigator's resistance. A navigator trained to maintain discipline against inhuman horror might have that discipline bypassed by something that seemed human, seemed relatable, seemed like a cry for help rather than an attack. I know this. I am fully aware that what I experienced may have been a sophisticated exploitation of my perceptual vulnerabilities. I am reporting it anyway because the alternative, which is to reduce it to a classification and file it away, feels like the greater dishonesty. The screaming that came through the field on the 7th day was human in its cadence, in its exhaustion, in the way it was not the scream of immediate attack, but the scream of prolonged suffering. There is a difference between the scream that a person makes when something terrible happens to them suddenly and the scream that a person makes when something terrible has been happening to them for a very long time and they have stopped expecting it to stop. The latter is quieter, more interior. It is the sound of someone who is still screaming because it is all they have left, not because they believe anyone is listening. That was what pressed against the field. Not one voice, not a dozen. The third eye opened at the 8th hour of that 7th day morning, my hand already moving to close the shielding panel the moment anything threatening presented showed me a landscape I had not seen in 47 transits. The warp's surface, as I perceive, it had changed. The roiling currents of psychic energy that I was accustomed to reading as weather were still there, but beneath them, in a layer I had not had reason to perceive before because I had not known to look for it, there was something else. Something like sedimentation. Layers of, I have no better word than this, residue. Thick and dark. Not empty but dense with compressed something, the way a wound that has been closed too quickly is dense with what cannot escape. And from this layer the screaming. Not at me. That was the distinction that unmade 11 years of protocol. It was not directed at me. It was simply there, present, constant, the sound of something that had been screaming for long enough that it no longer expected an audience. I was not being attacked. I was not being deceived. I was being heard, in the same way that you hear, by accident, through a wall you did not know was thin, the sound of someone else's grief. I sat in the couch for 43 minutes without moving or recording. Then, I began to try to understand what I was hearing. The Navigator Academies teach us that the warp is a reflection of humanity's psychic output, not a metaphor, a structural reality. The pain and hope and belief and cruelty of billions of human minds, spread across 10,000 years of civilization, manifest in the warp as substance. The great entities of the warp as substance, The great entities of the warp, which the ecclesiarchy renames in the language of demon and archenemy and neverborn, are themselves assemblages of this output, concentrated and given form by the volume of emotion directed at specific concepts over specific spans of time. Khorne, the lord of battle fury and blood, exists because humanity has generated enough of those specific emotions to give him mass. This is not inquisitorial speculation. This is navigator training given to us, because understanding the warp's structure is prerequisite to navigating it. I had understood this abstractly. I had known the facts. What I had not understood, sitting in the couch in the Oculus with the screaming pressing against the field from below, was what it meant for individual souls. The warp is a reflection of humanity's psychic output. Humanity's psychic output includes every person who has ever died in sufficient agony or sufficient fear to leave a residue. This is also documented in sources available to navigators above 3rd grade with appropriate clearance. Strong emotion at the moment of death leaves a mark. The warp absorbs it. What happens to that mark afterward is a subject on which the ecclesiarchy and the Ordo Malleus and the navigator houses all have different answers, and all 3 answers are politically important, and therefore none of them are necessarily true. I was perceiving, if I was perceiving, what I believed I was perceiving, the accumulated residue of human deaths. Potentially many of them. Potentially, given the density and age of the layer I was reading, many billions of them. I am a navigator, not a theologian. I am not equipped to tell you what that means for doctrine. I am equipped to tell you what I heard. It was not the warp's native hunger. It was not the inhuman pressure of entities that have never been human and never wish to be. It was old grief, sediment of suffering, the baseline noise of the imperium of man's 10,000 years of war and sacrifice and purge and crusade and attrition, all of it, real, all of it happened, all of it pressing against the membrane of the Geller field with the weight of every death that left a mark. I want to be precise about this because precision is all I have. I do not know if those were souls. I do not know if what I was hearing constituted the persistence of individual consciousness or the echo of emotion without, to mind behind it. I am not a priest. I am not an inquisitor. I am a navigator who spent 11 years traversing the warp with the working assumption that the Imperium's dead were at peace in the Emperor's light, or at least that the question was not mine to navigate. On the 7th day of the Calyx Deep Crossing, the question became mine. The field fluctuated for the first time at the 11th hour of the 7th day. Not catastrophically. The telemetry showed a 3-point variation in field cohesion, lasting approximately 90 seconds, before returning to nominal. By any documented standard, this was a minor event. The Geller field is designed to withstand significant fluctuation before integrity becomes a concern. Engin Seer Methods flagged it in the engineering log as routine and adjusted the harmonic resonators accordingly. To me, in the Oculus, those 90 seconds were the most significant event of my navigator career. When the field fluctuated, the screaming changed. It was not louder. Volume implies sound, and what I perceived was not precisely sound. It was more precise, as though the 3-point variation in field cohesion created, for 90 seconds, a gap in the insulation, a place where the membrane was thinner, and through that thinning, what had been diffuse became directed. Not at the ship, not at me as a threat vector or a prey target, at me as a person, at me as something that could hear. The screaming that pressed through the thinning was still not language, but it was closer to language than it had been. It carried intent that I could parse in the way that you can parse the intent of someone speaking a language you have never studied, but whose tone and cadence and urgency communicate something essential regardless of the words. The intent was, we are here. We have been here. We have been here for a very long time, and nothing has changed. And the weight does not diminish, and we do not know if anyone knows. Then the field cohesion returned to nominal. The gap closed. The diffuse layer resumed its position beneath the warp's currents, still pressing, still constant, no longer focused, still screaming, but no longer directed. I sat in the couch with my hands flat on my thighs, which is a discipline I was taught from moments of strong psi reaction. Hands visible, palms down, grounding you in the physical. I counted my breath in the prescribed sequence. I did not move for a long time. Then I filed my log entry. Field fluctuation at the 11th hour, 3-point variation, 90-second duration. Anomalous psi perception during fluctuation period, consistent with prior observation. Geller field integrity restored and holding it nominal. No risk to ship or company. Will continue to monitor. I did not report the specifics of what I perceived during the fluctuation. This was a choice I made consciously, with full awareness of what I was omitting. I made it because there is no approved category in Navigator reporting for what I had perceived, and an approved category exists for precisely this purpose: to allow the inquisitorial review teams that assess Navigator logs to efficiently process a large volume of reports by collapsing everything into recognizable forms. If I filed the specifics, they would be recategorized, reduced, filed under approved terms that would strip the thing I had heard of its actual nature. I was not ready to have it stripped of its nature. I had not yet finished trying to understand it. This is the choice that led, by the route I will now describe, to this recording in the gray Medicaid Bay with 4 hours remaining. 8 days into the transit, the pattern ceased to be below my attention and became impossible to ignore. I had slept in brief intervals, waking at each passive. Telemetry, alarm, which were frequent enough that what I called sleep was closer to horizontal rest with one part of the mind still engaged. I had eaten twice in 2 days. The ration packs kept in the tower supply locker were dense, calorie efficient, flavorless. I ate them because I needed to function, not because I was hungry. I had stopped being hungry somewhere on the 7th day, around the time the screaming began. Captain Sodale called on the tower intercom at the 3rd morning hour to inquire about my health. She had been monitoring the tower's life sign feeds, which is within her authority, and my vital patterns had apparently raised a flag in the medical AI. "Palaskis," she said. Her voice through the Vox grill was flat, with the particular flatness of concern being managed carefully. "You've slept less than 9 hours in the past 2 days. I am aware, Captain. The transit log shows you filed 17 anomalous psi perception reports since day 4. Also aware, the field is nominal. Methes has confirmed it 4 times. Yes." A pause. I heard her breathing. I knew that pause. I had worked with her for 9 years, and I knew the shape of the pause she made when she was deciding how directly to say something she already knew she was going to say. "Do you need to be relieved?" she asked. This was the question whose answer would determine the next 4 days. A navigator requesting relief is not a disgrace. It is the correct response to a situation beyond the navigator's capacity to safely manage, and most captains would rather dock at destination a few days late with a living navigator than arrive on schedule with a navigator who has unraveled in the oculus. This is pragmatism, not mercy, but the outcome is the same. I could have said yes. I have thought about this in the 11 days since our arrival at Port Seraphon. I have thought about tea while the inquisitorial representative waited in the docking ring, and while the captain gave me these 4 hours, and while I sat down to make this recording. If I had said yes, if I had asked for relief, she would have reduced our speed, and I would have come off active navigation duty, and whatever I was going to discover in the next 4 days would have happened to someone else, or not happened at all. "No," I said. "I'm managing the anomaly. I am not at risk of psi contact compromise." This was true as far as it went. I was not at risk of psi contact compromise in the technical sense. I was not being attacked. My mental discipline was intact. The entities of the warp had not found a vector through my perception to exploit. What was happening was something the training did not classify as a compromise risk, because the training had not anticipated it. "All right," she said, "but you eat and you sleep. That's an order, not a request." "Understood, Captain." She disconnected. I ate one of the ration packs and lay down in the couch and tried to sleep. The field hummed. Below the hum, very faint, the screaming continued. I slept for 3 hours. I dreamed of the house academies, which is where I had first learned to look through the third eye. In the dream, my training instructor, a first-grade navigator named Ossian, who had 7 transits and whose left eye had gone milky with some injury he never explained, was standing before a class of 12 novices and saying something I could not quite hear. I kept trying to move closer to understand the words. The other novices were not moving. They were seated perfectly still, faces forward, receiving. I was the only one who could not hear. Every time I took a step forward, the room extended, and Ossian's voice remained at the same indistinct distance. I woke when the passive telemetry alarm sounded, field still nominal. I logged 3 hours sleep and returned to monitoring. On the 9th day, I made the adjustment that I want to describe as carefully as I know how. Because it is the center of everything that follows. Because it is the center of everything that follows. And I have had 11 days to second-guess it, and I am still not certain it was the wrong choice. I had been monitoring the screaming for 2 days with the approach I had always applied to anomalous psi phenomena. Passive observation, distance maintained, report, and continue navigation. The approach exists for good reason. A navigator who engages with warp anomalies directly is a navigator who creates vectors for compromise. You observe, you record, you do not reach back. This is not cruelty. This is the only functional posture, because the warp is vast and hungry, and any opening you create in reaching toward it, no matter how carefully intentioned, is an opening that can be exploited. But I had spent 2 days observing, and what I observed had not changed. It was not attempting to exploit me. It was not targeting me as prey. It was simply there, as it had presumably been there for every transit that had passed through this region of the Calyx Deep, and perhaps for transits that had passed through different regions, and perhaps for a very long time before any navigator existed to notice it. The weight of what it was did not decrease with observation. The distance, I maintained, did not make it smaller. It simply continued, and in its continuation was a quality that I had no training to process. It seemed to deserve acknowledgement. I want to be precise here. I am not a mystic. I am a technical practitioner whose specialty is a form of psychic perception that happens to interface with the immaterium directly, and I apply to my work the same discipline that any specialist applies to theirs. I am not given to sentiment about the warp. 11 years of navigating it have given me deep respect for it, and no affection for it whatsoever. I did not make what I made because I felt moved by emotion. I made it because I could not find a logical reason not to, and because the weight of witnessing something without acknowledgement is itself a choice. What I did was small. I want to be clear that it was small, and I do not know if it did anything. What I did was open the third eye fully, without the standard monitoring filters that keep perception constrained to the minimum necessary for navigation, and I did not sweep the warp as I was trained to do. I looked, directly, at the layer of sediment beneath the currents. I looked at it the way you look at a person, rather than the way you look at terrain. I did not speak. You cannot speak into the warp from within a Geller field in any meaningful sense. I did not pray, because I am trained to keep prayer separate from warp navigation, to prevent the psi resonance of faith-based emotion from interfering with third-eye sensitivity. I did not project psionic energy, which is both beyond my training and genuinely dangerous in the context of a transit. I looked, only that. I looked with the specific quality of attention that recognizes rather than observes, that says, I see you. Not that you deserve this, not that I can help, not even that I understand, just, I see you. I know you are here. I have been here for 9 days, and I have heard you, and I am not pretending. I have not. The screaming did not stop. I had not expected it to. The layer of sediment did not diminish. The field indicators remained exactly as they were. By every external measure, nothing changed. What changed was internal, which is the only change that mattered, and possibly the most dangerous kind. For a period of time I cannot precisely quantify, something in the warp's sediment layer responded to my attention, not with words, not with directed pressure, with something that I can only describe, badly, as texture. The undifferentiated screaming became, briefly, complex, specific, individual, the way white noise becomes distinct voices when you turn the gain up sufficiently. Still noise, still overwhelming, but within it, differentiation. Patterns that suggested individuality, implied particularity. A grief that was different from the grief beside it. A suffering that had a shape distinguishable from the suffering adjacent to it. Billions of shapes potentially, differentiated by whatever it is that made each of those people particular when they were alive. I closed the third eye before I could do anything with that information. I closed it with the same deliberate force I would use to close a bulkhead against vacuum, because I was aware that what I was doing had passed the point where it was passive and entered a territory for which I had no map and no training, and no certainty at all about what I was actually perceiving versus what the warp was showing me it wanted me to see. I sat in the couch for a long time. The hum was unchanged. The field was nominal. I did not file a log entry for that monitoring period. We emerged from the warp transit above Port Seraphon, on schedule, within the projected window, with no incident that the ship's logs or the field telemetry would flag for inquisitorial review. Engineer Methes certified the Geller field at post-transit inspection. Captain Sodale recorded the crossing as uneventful in her Navigator performance evaluation, with a notation about my reduced sleep hours that she flagged as a health concern. The crew went about the work of arrival. Docking procedures commenced. I filed a full transit report in the approved format. I included all 17 anomalous psi perception observations with their relevant telemetry data. I included the field F, fluctuation and its duration. I included my assessment of the Calyx Deep Psi turbulence zone as warranting increased monitoring on future transits. I did not include what I have described above. The inquisitorial representative was waiting in the docking ring. His name is Interrogator Casvan Maris of the Ordo Malleus. He contacted the ship before we had finished docking procedures. Captain Sodale told me this and told me I had 4 hours before he came aboard. I do not know how he knew. Possibly he did not know specifically, only that my transit log contained enough anomalous observations to warrant interview. The Ordo Malleus reviews Navigator logs. This is routine. Possibly the field fluctuation on the 7th day flagged an alert I was unaware of. Possibly. And this is the possibility I find most interesting to sit with. My 9 days in the Oculus with a third eye, open longer and wider than I have kept it in any previous transit, simply made me visible in ways I cannot account for. Captain Sodale gave me 4 hours. I think she did it because she has worked with me for 9 years and believes I have done nothing wrong, which is a judgment I appreciate and cannot fully share. She also, I suspect, knows it will not change the outcome. I am recording this testimony in the Medicae Bay, gray walls, counterseptic, and old Prometheum, because someone should have the specifics, not the approved form with its approved categories and its institutional language that efficiently strips events of their nature. The specifics, as well as I can render them, in language that does not reduce them to something manageable. There are, in the warp substrate, through which every void-faring vessel in the Imperium transits thousands of times a day across 10,000 inhabited worlds, something that the Navigator academies do not train us to look for, something that sits below hostile currents and the named entities and the documented threats that we are given categories to classify, something that has been there long enough to be sediment, something that is, if my perception has any reliability at all, comprised of the accumulated residue of human suffering on a scale that I lack mathematics to estimate. I do not know if they are souls. I do not know if the persistence of emotional residue in the immaterium constitutes consciousness or identity or personhood in any meaningful sense. I know that the ecclesiarchy has doctrines about this, and the Ordo Malleus has doctrines about this, and the Navigator houses have doctrines about this, and none of those doctrines are the same, and all of them are more politically convenient than the question deserves. I know that I looked at the layer of screaming in the Calyx Deep's warp substrate, and for a period I cannot quantify precisely, it looked back, not with hunger, not with malice, with something that resembled, more than anything else in my experience, the specific quality of attention of someone who has been trying to be heard for a very long time and had resigned themselves to silence, suddenly confronted with the possibility that they might not have been screaming into nothing. I know that I do not know what to do with this. I know that Interrogator Maris is waiting in the docking ring with the resources of the Ordo Malleus, and that the Ordo Malleus has very clear categories for what navigators report after transits and very clear procedures for what happens when those reports fall outside the categories. I know that my omission from the transit log constitutes, at minimum, a violation of navigator reporting requirements, and that the question of whether it constitutes something more serious will be determined by people with more authority than I have. I know that I left those 11 years of service out of the official log because what I found in the Calyx Deep's warp substrate cannot be accurately conveyed in the approved format without being reduced to something the format can process, which is to say, without being rendered into something that can be filed, classified, and set aside. I know that the gray walls smell of counterseptic and old promethium. I know I have approximately 2 hours remaining. I know that the hum of the Geller field is absent now that we are docked, and the silence where it was is where I am most aware of everything I heard when it was present. The warp does not scream all at once. It has been screaming for 10,000 years, and the screaming does not diminish. It accumulates, it layers, and presses, and waits in the substrate of the only path we have through the void. We have through the void, which every ship must traverse, which every navigator sits above in the oculus and learns to read as weather, rather than as what it is. I do not know what it is. I am certain, after 9 days of listening, that the approved categories are not it. Someone should know. Someone should know that 11 transits passed the training that taught me to look at the warp as terrain. There is a navigator sitting in a gray Medicaid bay who looked at the screaming long enough for it to look back, and what he found in the looking was not hunger, was not malice, was not the cold intent of entities that have never been human, was something that expected nothing, was still screaming anyway. And in the 90 seconds of field fluctuation on the 7th day of a routine transit through the Calyx Deep, found for the only time in what might have been an eternity of screaming, something that looked back. I do not have a doctrine for this, neither do they. I think that is the thing I need someone to know. This testimony was recovered from the personal vox log of Navigator 3rd Grade Osias's Doran Palaskis, House Palaskis, assigned to the Void Trader Unbroken Covenant. The log was encrypted by Navigator Palaskis and transmitted to House Palaskis' archival relay station at Port Seraphon before his interview with Interrogator Casvin Maris of the Ordo Malleus. Palaskis was remanded to inquisitorial custody upon completion of interview. His current disposition is not a matter of public record. The transit record of the Unbroken Covenant through the Calyx Deep has been classified under Ordo Malleus designation Sigma Imperialis. The Calyx Deep Transit Corridor was flagged for navigational review. No subsequent navigational restrictions were implemented. Transit traffic through the Calyx Deep continues at standard frequency. The testimony was retained in the House Pulaski's archive for 43 years before being forwarded, through channels that remain unclear, to the author of this account. I have reviewed it 3 times. I find I cannot reduce it to something manageable. I have decided that reducing it to something manageable would be its own kind of failure. I record it here as it was given to me, as nearly complete as I can verify for whoever finds it next. The warp is still there. The ships still cross it. The field still hums. Somewhere below that hum, if Pelaskis was right, the accumulation continues. You who find this testimony will decide what to do with it. I found